You Ethic Cuties and the 40% of you who have still not subscribed to the Ethicsverse, what the heck is wrong with you? We do this every Tuesday and Thursday. Welcome to the coolest place to be every Thursday at noon Eastern. If you think fixing our workplace can fix our world, let's get a massive emoji explosion right now for the one and only Jerry Zach. We have a phenomenal episode for you today. We're going to be talking about rethinking risk ownership across the organization. We've all been there. We build our risk matrix. We score our risk, we brief the board, and then nothing actually changes. And risk does not originate in compliance. It originates in IT, or it originates in sales, or it originates in operations. And sometimes we're like the last ones to know. So we're going to be talking to Jerry Zach. He spent decades in the risk space. He spent many years running SCCE and HCCA. And he has advised companies across any industry that you can think of. And so he's going to introduce us to this idea of risk relationships as the foundation of risk ownership within the organization. So as we get started, we got a couple announcements to run through. This is a special Father's Day edition. Okay, so dads get 1 day per year. Okay, and so definitely drop your LinkedIn URL in the chat and drop one thing that you really learned from your dad, your favorite takeaway, a quote that he did. Let's do that to get moving here. And I'm going to run through these announcements. So if you're here for credits, this is the place to be. We are accredited with the Compliance Certification Board as well as SHRM and HRCI. So this episode is eligible for credits for all Ethicsverse members. So yet another reason to subscribe to the Ethicsverse, okay? And we're giving away this book that I love. I've read this book a couple of times now. It's called Influence is Your Superpower by the one and only Zoe Chance. And it talks about how to have more influence and be more influential. We're all born with this sort of skill of influence. And our job in ethics and compliance is really to influence behavior up and down the stack of stakeholders in the organization. So we're giving away 5 of these today because we love you. And so stay active in the chat. Ask us some questions. We'll try to work those into the discussion. And also definitely download the benchmark report if you have not done that yet. This is out. We've continued to get a lot of great feedback for it, or a lot of great feedback about it. And, you know, our job is to make better bets with our time. I talk about this on every single episode, it seems. And part of that is really directing our team and our limited resources towards the risk hotspots in our organization. So this benchmark report has a ton of great information in it, a bunch of great KPIs for you to, you know, measure your program against, but it also gives you some great clues on how you can better cut your data within your case management system to uncover some of those things. Jerry is going to be back in a quick sec. And if not, I guess I'll just be talking myself to you guys all day. There he is. Okay. All good. I'm just kidding around. Also want to share with you our new policy management platform. This is called Policy Plus. It's going like hotcakes. People seem to really like this because policy management is one of those massive time sucks for any compliance program. And it's something that is really ready and really ripe for AI to do a lot of the work while still allowing and injecting the human beings into that process to make the right decisions and so forth. So if you would like to improve your policy management program or your policy management process, it's worth checking out Policy Plus. It has AI drafting. It has all the information that you need right there at your fingertips and can really condense down this arduous process where there's policies all over the place and you're following up with people over email, bringing that all into one location and giving you that perfect bird's eye view of where you're at with your overall policy program health. So if you're interested in Policy Plus, book a demo on the console or go directly to ethico.com. And someone will reach out to you immediately. And if you have not heard yet, everybody is talking about this. Everybody actually can't stop talking about it. Ethicsverse Day 3.0. Last year, it was a record-breaking event, the biggest ethics and compliance event in the history of the world. And we're going to try to double it this year. So Ethicsverse Day is on July 23rd. We have 4 phenomenal sessions. We have Dan Ariely, one of my favorite authors ever, a behavioral science expert who's written some of my favorite behavioral science books. We have DOJ folks. We have the women from GWIC. So if you don't listen to the GWIC podcast, the Great Women in Compliance podcast, you absolutely should. And if you don't know who they are, definitely want to come to Ethicsverse Day because we're going to be wrapping up the day with them. And we're having an AI debate. You know, I love a nice blood sport debate. And so circle your calendars for July 23rd. More information is going to be coming on that. And with that, let's get one more massive emoji explosion. You know, I talked up all these Ethic Cuties to Jerry a lot. And so would love for you guys to give him a warm welcome. How's it going, Jerry?
I'm doing great. Hello, Nick. How are you doing? Thanks for having me here. It's a real pleasure. It's so relevant that it's a Father's Day edition, too, because what I got from my father was an Internal Revenue Service agent examiner. So the whole idea of compliance was kind of a big deal in our household, because he was catching the tax cheats for 40 or so years there.
So this is like in your blood. This whole thing is really is in your blood. That's awesome. So Jerry, before we dive in, I'd love for you to share a little bit about your organization and what you're doing now and what you have coming out. This new AI risk assessment sounds really cool.
Great. Yeah, thanks. Yeah, so, ever since leaving SCCE, I've been doing consulting work, and I very quickly started up a company called Risk Trek, which is the arm through which I do advisory work in risk management, everything from compliance risk management to fraud risk management, and even the broader types of enterprise risk management, helping organizations grapple with risk in various stages. But along the way, I've also been involved with my good friend and business partner, Jim Massey.
Love Jim.
Yeah. It's hard not to love Jim, isn't it? Jim
he's like one of the most likable people ever. And he has just beautiful blue eyes as well, to boot.
Oh, my God.
I love Jim.
Yeah, I find myself saying, try not to stare too much at Jim's eyes.
Yeah, don't fall into those pools. Yeah, exactly.
He's got those Paul Newman eyes, It's But yeah, it's not so. In addition to being a great-looking guy, he's an amazing, individual at a personal level as well as just his intellect and the way he thinks about risk and things of that nature. So it's been a real pleasure partnering with him and a fantastic development team. And what we've been doing is building this tool. It's been in works for more than 15 months at this point, and it's out there. It's ready. We're getting clients. It's in a company we've dubbed Eastward because there's a long story there, in terms of looking eastward. But it is an AI-assisted risk assessment tool, and it's using AI in what I think is really one of the best applications of AI to do so much of the legwork that the humans never really have time to do. It's not replacing anyone, it's making everyone more efficient. And it's a fantastic tool. It's a way of really enhancing risk management broadly or narrowly, like just in a compliance or a fraud context or enterprise-wide. And enabling, rapid, continuous updating of risk assessments, I think, is one of the coolest features that it enables. So when regulators start saying, you need to get away from that annual check-the-box risk assessment, this is one way to do that at a fraction of the cost of adding FTEs. So I'm very happy with that.
So, our big takeaways today are going to be about how to better map the risk relationships back to their point of origin, the human dimension of risk from persuasion of vulnerability. That's why we're talking about, that's why we're giving away Zoe Chance's book, and really how to better construct kind of a risk-centric appetite statement that leaders can actually engage with. So, as I was saying before, Jerry, you've worked, you spend decades, working in and around compliance programs. What do you think is the most common mistake you see folks make when it comes to how they kind of think about managing risk?
Yeah, really, it's sort of two things equally come to mind, when I think about that. One is just how organizations generally view risk. Risk has a bad reputation, because it's viewed as something to avoid practically. And there's this risk, how do I avoid this risk sort of a mentality rather than thinking of it as, it's just a necessary element. It's a necessary step in our strategy. Risk is embedded in our strategy. We don't acknowledge that enough, that there are risks associated with our strategy. And it's a necessary risk. You take a risk when you cross the street. The safer bet would be to never cross the street. But we don't do that, do we? We cross the street. We're accepting that risk. The same thing goes for all of our strategy, and viewing risk more. In fact, sometimes I like to start risk conversations out by saying, what needs to go right for you to achieve your strategic goals, rather than focusing first on what can go wrong, because ultimately you end up talking about the same things. The other thing that I think, and the bigger, backdrop to what we're going to be talking about today is, too often I see organizations viewing risk as existing in isolation. A risk exists by itself. Therefore, it's easy to dub somebody the risk owner and place all that responsibility. And for starters, the owner very rarely has the ability to fully manage the risk. Of course, you inherently need cooperation, collaboration from others. But even more importantly is this failure to recognize that there's this risk relationship concept and what I call a chain of risks. And that is so important, both to managing the risk that might be on your plate, but also I think it's important to positioning yourself as, a strategic leader within the organizations, recognizing these risk relationships.
Yeah, this concept of like risk as being something inherently bad, I think it's wrong. To your exact point, there's this inherent risk reward relationship, which sort of implies that there's never any reward without taking some risk. To your point, even if it's just baking some cookies, there's some risk and you're going to get burned pulling those out of the oven, right? And there's the only place that there's no risk is like laying in a coffin. So what we need to do is we need to try to minimize the risk in the context of the reward. So given a stated reward, how do we achieve that reward, that upside, by minimizing the risk to the furthest extent possible?
Absolutely.
When you talk about, please go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, I was just agreeing. Yep.
So when you talk about risk relationships, like, what do you mean by that? Is this, why is this sort of a novel concept, or why is this sort of a revolutionary sort of way to think about risks? And why does it matter, do you think, for compliance professionals to start thinking this way, as opposed to sort of the old world way of thinking about risk?
Yeah, I mean, it's important to just simply recognize that our risk likely does not exist in a vacuum. And of course, compliance doesn't necessarily own many compliance risks anyway. I mean, we're facilitating the management of that risk. But when you say the risk might exist in the sales department, it likely doesn't exist solely in the sales department either, or any other department. It's related. It's a series or a chain of risks. And hopefully, each of the risks in the chain is being managed, but they're probably, quote, owned or managed by different parties. So it's usually this risk. In other words, and compliance oftentimes is somewhere in the middle. It's towards the end of the chain of risk, but it's in the middle somewhere, meaning there are other risk events that are leading up to this potential compliance risk. And then after it becomes a compliance risk, there might be add-on risks that affect other parties there as well. So why this is important is really kind of twofold. One is it helps gain a broader organizational understanding of risk and what is going to go into the management of my risk. I might only be still assigned that one risk. And I'll go through a detailed example with you after I kind of throw this out there. But it's that understanding that this risk is related to many other risks. In some cases, very many other risks. And what that leads to is this a better picture of where this risk sits, which positions you better to manage that risk. It helps you identify who some of the collaborators are, but it's positioning you it's changing how you're positioned in terms of, and rather than you asking for someone to help you manage this risk, you're now in a position of saying, your risk relates to my risk. If we manage our two risks together and we collaborate, I'm helping you and you're helping me at the same time. It's not just all about, can you please help me manage my risk? And compliance people routinely do that. Can you help me manage my risk? This enables the compliance professional to say, wait a second. What I'm considering to be maybe a driver of my risk is actually a risk to you. So if we reframe that discussion and acknowledge that, it puts us in a much better position.
Yeah, I mean, risk is such a, under that framework, it's a lot more amorphous. It's a lot more sort of ethereal to some degree, as opposed to sort of the simple kind of old approach to try to like box a risk in and say, like, this is the risk. To your point, in many cases, it's kind of a dependent variable in sort of a multivariate equation where there's all these other sort of influencing factors, and the position you are in that sort of chain of interaction can have a different sort of effect, or the risk that you're kind of facing is, to your point, a little bit downstream. We have a great question from Amanda here. I'd love for you to weigh in on. Thanks for this, Amanda. Is it your experience that people tend to see the first risk and just kind of stop there? that they don't see the risk that come further down the line, this sort of, like where it sort of pops up sort of across the organization.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. That is exactly the most common problem. They view it as, here's this risk, I need to tackle it. They're not thinking about where the risk came from, nor are they thinking about where the risk could lead to. And they're just tackling that one piece of the risk rather than viewing it a bit more holistically. I guess really what we're getting at is viewing it that way, kind of backing up for a second and saying, where did it come from? Where might it go next? And I've got an example or two I can walk through. But yeah, that is the issue that we're really talking about here today.
So how do you kind of go about helping a compliance professional to trace this risk back to its true point of origin? Like, is that an important first step to say, like, where does this originate, and then kind of see how it sort of trickles throughout the organization? And if so, like, why is this mapping exercise both difficult and important?
Yeah, good question. And part of the answer is that we're already doing some of this mapping. We're just not recognizing what we're doing. By that, what I mean is when we identify a compliance, let's go with bribery risk because it's one of the easiest to use that illustrates these concepts. So we're trying to manage a risk that we could violate the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act or any other kind of a bribery provision. As part of that, we're going to identify a few different factors in assessing that risk, right? We're going to start with identifying what drives that risk, or we should be, right? Like what leads to somebody wanting to pay, needing, or perhaps making bribery payments. So we're looking at drivers of the risk. But then we're also looking at preventive controls, detective controls, and the impact of the bribe. So we got at least those four variables associated with our bribery risk that we are assessing in one manner or another. And by doing that, what we're also accomplishing without realizing it often is that each one of those factors might in turn be a risk for somebody else. Okay, so let's work with bribery on this for a second. What's one of the drivers of bribery? Well, it's having this perverse kind of an incentive system and unrealistic goals and all the pressure that goes along with the unrealistic goals. And we view that as a driver of bribery risk. But it's much more than that. Shouldn't that pop up as an HR risk in the HR department? The answer is yes. It is a risk for HR to have these perverse incentives, high pressure work environments, like whatever you want to call it, a culture risk, an HR risk. What's another driver of bribery risk? Maybe competition. It's a highly competitive environment. And for us to succeed, it provides that strong incentive to begin paying bribes. Well, that's a strategy risk, right? Because part of our strategy is dependent upon how we navigate ourselves with respect to competition. Do we view that as did we identify that as a risk to our strategy? You see, so who owns these risks? Who owns the perverse incentive risk? Is that HR? Who owns the strategy risk? Is that, some executive team, group? And then when you start, I'll go, one or two more quick examples, all related to the same risk. When you start talking about how we manage our bribery risk, you get into the different ways of paying a bribe, perhaps. So you say, well, one method of paying a bribe might be through a shell company. Well, isn't setting up a shell company inherently already a risk? It typically would show up in like a fraud risk category or a financial risk category, setting up of a shell company. So that our preventive control actually should show up as also a risk for somebody else. You see, so the setting up of the shell company, and if you go through to where it goes after compliance, if a bribe is paid, we've got several potentially bad consequences. The most obvious maybe being reputational damage. Okay, so who's managing reputation risk in our organization? Have they thought of non-compliance as something that could lead to reputation? You see, so we're passing the baton along the chain here. One other risk, and I saw this firsthand a couple of times, is the company who pays bribes usually passes the cost of that bribe onto its customer.
Great point.
If that customer is a government agency, now you've got another compliance risk for having the government pay the bribe for you. So you've got a secondary compliance risk and a fraud risk. Who's managing those risks? You see, so by thinking of these other elements that we're hopefully already considering as we assess the bribery risk, we're identifying other risks And that in turn leads to then other people that are inherently involved in our management of risk. And we can help them manage their risk. So that's really the crux of this.
Yeah, there's like sort of there's an interconnected nature of your body. There's an interconnected nature, to your point, of a business. There's all these different departments that have different sort of agendas and goals and so forth. And very few of these risks, I would say, really just live in one spot, can be just sort of boxed into a matrix and say, yep, I've sort of defined this risk and sort of all the vectors of intersection within this one, cell on the Excel sheet or in whatever piece of software. To your point, this interconnected nature really compounds the the risk of sort of missing the true shape of those risks.
Yes, absolutely. No, it's absolutely. These chains are vital to understand. And bribery is a good example for a number of other reasons as well. I mean, and one of which is that it's just so dang complicated. There's so many different ways of structuring bribes. I gave the example of paying it through a shell company, but you can pay it through payroll. You can pay it through expenses. You can pay it by adding people into your payroll that don't belong there. You could, there's so many,
right,
swapping third parties, each of which then can be viewed as a risk to some other risk owner. It could be a risk to the payroll function. It could be a risk to the customer due diligence function or the vendor due diligence function. But viewing it that way, I think, really sets you off on this really, really good path towards managing your risk and setting you up for better success within your organization.
So I want you to, if you don't mind, you've kind of talked about this chain, right, of like risk relationship, risk ownership, control ownership. I'd like you to kind of walk us through that with a little bit more detail, maybe through the lens of like what breaks down for an organization when they skip that first step.
What is breaking down, it says, I'm trying to think of the best way to put this. For starters, your assumption is that this risk event just magically appears, and it doesn't.
Right.
It's acknowledging, kind of to your point that you made previously, it's like finding the origins of this risk. And to me, that's why some of the keys are those risk drivers. Anyone who does compliance, fraud, any type of risk management should not only identify the risk, but identify the drivers. What leads to this risk? It might be causal. It might not necessarily even be causal, but it always precedes the risk. And then what can I do to either monitor for that, prevent it, et cetera, which is often then time through other parties within my organization. Okay, so yeah, it's a critical way of looking at risk.
So, maybe this is a stupid question, but like, does then, given this sort of multivariate thing that we talked about, or the multifaceted shape of risk and the fact that it sort of intersects and can originate and affect risks sort of across the organization, does that make like quote unquote risk ownership just as a concept kind of a misnomer? Like, is that even like conceptually kind of a stupid concept?
It's a good question. And I would love to abandon the term risk ownership, but I also understand that if everything is done by committee and no one's the chair of the committee, things don't get done. So there kind of has to be a chair of the risk ownership, but I think that by acknowledging that these things that we need to help manage my risk are actually risks of other people, inherently creates that opportunity for the collaboration that's necessary. We're building a committee, and my job on the committee is to manage my piece of the risk. It's basically almost like taking a step back from the risk that we're dealing with and say, no, this isn't one risk. This is a team of risks. So we need a team to manage that. So the ownership really gets spread around technically, but we're still breaking it down to into its individual components, okay? Because each risk is distinct. But by acknowledging that connection, we're acknowledging this need for consideration of it as a chain. So yeah, I get it. It's going to be hard to get entirely away from the term risk owner, but risk. And so, in fact, in some cases, maybe you have an owner and other collaborators, risk collaborators. You're identifying them as collaborators rather than just as someone that you need, to do something for you. but because they're collaborators, because these are risks to them as well.
I'd love to hear in the chat, how many of you are in an organization that uses OKRs as a mechanism to like drive, improvement in the business? This is a very sort of common concept today. And in OKRs, it's kind of a similar concept to what we're talking about here. You might have a couple of top level OKRs that then sort of, fractalize out to different departments, because the organization is not going to be able to achieve this sort of top level OKR or this top level objective without sort of key results coming across these different organizations and or these different departments. And there's usually owners, this in theory should trickle down to the individual level. And so what you're talking about is really kind of a reframe of the sort of this risk management process. By its nature, risk management is difficult because organizations are so complex and things are moving around so much. And I think, as you're kind of talking about this frame, it really kind of resonated with me, because this kind of concept of something that's very complex and sort of needs everybody's participation to varying degrees to achieve the ends that we have in mind is at least attempted to be captured through this other OKR framework.
Yeah. No, and, as you were saying that, it occurred to me that, one of the things that we're talking about here is the correlation between risk and strategy. When we think of setting strategy, it's common that we think of it in terms of this cascading level of responsibilities. That it's the board and the senior management team has set the strategy, and we've acknowledged, okay, this department needs to fulfill this role in it, this department needs to fulfill that role in it, and things of that nature. But we don't do that as well with risk. The flip side of strategy, of course, is the risk associated with that strategy. So, and they're in lockstep. They're going hand in hand together. So it's odd that we do that sometimes with respect to strategy. We've got company goals, department goals, when you talk about different performance measures and things, and then individual goals, manager goals, all that sort of rolls up and rolls down with respect to strategy. Why don't we do that with risk? Okay. Right. And this is a way of doing that. It's this acknowledgement of this interconnection that we already have, that concept of, we're all, we succeed and we fail together. Risk is a team sport. It's not an individual ownership sport. There might be a quarterback for this risk, but the quarterback can't do it all, right?
Yeah, he needs a tight end or something like that. Yeah,
exactly.
So Patricia asked the question: Isn't risk a group ownership and not individual ownership, especially enterprise risk management? Like, how is what we're talking about different?
Yeah, how it's different is that even in enterprise risk management, the ERM team doesn't own the risk. ERM is facilitating the discussion, the management of risk. And even with ERM, oftentimes there are identified risk owners, individuals or departments that own a particular risk. And again, the really sophisticated ERM departments are acknowledging that, well, we're kind of putting one group or one party in there as kind of owning it, but we understand that there are these interdependencies, across the risk and across the controls and things like that. So what we're talking about is, for starters, we're applying that concept within compliance, which is one of the most siloed groups that we see. So we're applying that concept to a greater extent here with compliance than we normally see. But also, even within enterprise risk management, we see silos. The ERM department itself is a silo in some organizations. Because they're saying, well, we don't touch compliance. Compliance does its own risk management, and we never talk to compliance. So they've sort of outsourced other elements of risk management to these other departments, and they're holding on to some. So it's really a way of connecting more of these. You might have some connections that are already established in others. I guess it's a long-winded way of saying some of these relationships and connections might already have been acknowledged, and sort of that team joint ownership of some risks. And what we're talking about is expanding that throughout the organization to do that with respect to all risks.
So this is a great kind of segue question. Thanks for this, Patricia. Patricia said, what if the heads of department, does have risk management skills or even able to speak or make a contribution about risk? Like, what if they don't have risk management skills, or they don't really know how to kind of think about it? And that's kind of leading to this next section that I want to talk about. So, go ahead.
Yeah, no, it's a great question for starters. I was just going to acknowledge that it's a fantastic question, because there's again a perception that an expertise in enterprise risk management is absolutely critical to this, and it's not. Certain elements of risk management are important, and that is, what are my principal risks that I have some degree of responsibility for, and what can I do about them, including what can I do to see them coming. So you can get away from the risk management terminology like impact and drivers and even risk appetite, which we'll talk about later. You can get away from those and still do risk management very, very well by carving out what a particular person's job is with respect to managing risk. It starts with the job description itself, believe it or not. When you start talking about what your job is, in addition to those very process-oriented things that go into a lot of job descriptions, there's that introduction, say, here's your role, and I think incorporating a little bit of the risk management slant to that is critical right out of the gate in setting up job descriptions. But yeah, you don't need to be risk management gurus to do a good job at managing risk.
I would say, though, that the compliance team of the future should be, at least on like an id or like self-identity level, viewing themselves as a specialized risk function inside the organization. And I don't think in 1996 or 2005, when compliance was in sort of the nascent stage, that was as high on the list from like a self-identity or from a, first line of the job description, perspective. And I think when we can kind of adopt that kind of a mentality or adopt that kind of identity, let's say, it helps us to not only view the things that are sort of coming across our desk or the things that are flowing through the organization in a bit of a different way. I think it helps us prioritize the impact that we need to have in light of the sort of broader organization strategy and objectives and things like that.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. And when compliance was getting its legs under it, in the 90s, like you said, it was oftentimes viewed as either a legal function only, so you had lawyers, et cetera,
right,
or people from the business unit, that had the risk. They were kind of assigned this responsibility for managing that particular risk. But gradually over the years, and if you look at how ERM has evolved over the years, this concept of interrelated risk is nothing new. Right. It's just that it was previously a subject of discussion only in these small classrooms where ERM people were meeting. No one else knew anything about it. It's like the secret sauce of ERM, and now it's I think it's come out that it can't be the secret sauce. Everybody has to view risk in this through this lens of how it's connected to other risks.
So, beyond this sort of technical framework, you've talked a lot about the sort of human dimension of this work. This is not just a bunch of sort of concepts in theories. This needs to get brought down to the human beings in the organization. So what does like persuasion, vulnerability, relationship building, like these kinds of things, what does that play, or like how does that play out in practice for compliance officers who are really trying to get this sort of risk-minded buy-in from other departments? What have you seen? What do you kind of, what are some of the pitfalls that you see over and over again that we might inadvertently be, falling victim to?
Well, I think as humans, we are automatically wired to gain comfort from staying in our silo and viewing our job in isolation. As long as I do my job, I'm happy, I feel good about myself, et cetera. And addressing risk in the manner that we're talking about here, Nick, I think creates a level of anxiety and vulnerability for people, because it's like, oh man, so if I want to help better manage my risk by acknowledging that other people's risks have an impact on my risk, I also have to acknowledge that my risk impacts them. So when I can't just be asking them for their help, I need to be vulnerable myself and say, here's what I'm doing about my risk. And that takes some confidence, right? Because you're basically saying, I'll show you mine if you show me yours, kind of a thing. It's that's uncomfortable to people, to a lot of people. But that's a critical first step in all this, is saying, in order for me to do my job better, I have to put myself in this a bit more vulnerable kind of a position. I have to have some conversations that might be awkward, because I'm going to be kind of telling someone that my risk affects their risk and asking them how they're managing their risk. That's not easy. It's much easier to just say, hey, can you help me? But that's missing one of the biggest points that is the key to success. So yeah, it's the issue of persuasion is very, very important here. How you approach people. You're going to find some people just want to stay in their silo, okay, and are going to be a hard sell, with this. And others are just going to be like, this sounds great, happy to help, because we're all in this together. Your risk is my risk, kind of a thing. But yeah, those first steps are difficult. They really are, and it gets to another one of those skills that you've talked about, I've talked about before. Some of those interpersonal skills that are so critical to success. You can't manage compliance risk by just staying in your office and never talking to people.
Right.
It's heavily driven by human interaction.
Yeah, I mean, compliance is a people business at the end of the day. I talk about this often, but like every lock can be picked. Like some locksmith can pick every lock. It's just another human being. And it really usually comes down to some mix of like relationship building, like you said, and sort of like smart framing in order to make, convey that, hey, we're on the same team and, I'm trying to fix this for the, broader objective of the organization, right? Like tying it to something that they care about, whether that's themselves from a selfish perspective inside their department or something that's sort of more broad within the organization. We have to come from a frame, to your point, like this should be a confidence builder. We have to come from a frame that like we can make those connections. We can get that buy-in, like that it's possible. It's not like an impossible thing, even if you're not sort of wired, even if you weren't kind of going door to door as like a salesperson in your, previous life.
Oh, exactly.
So
exactly. You have to acknowledge that sometimes we might need to start a few steps back. If my first conversation with someone is talking about collaborating on managing their risk and my risk, that might not be a great start if you've never had any relationship with this person.
Exactly.
You might need to start a few steps back.
So, like, how do you help a compliance professional to better develop this instinct of, sensing the atmosphere, like that kind of ability, that knack to like see an incoming risk before it becomes an event rather than like responding? So many people talk about how they hate living in reactionary mode. We want to get proactive, but sometimes in order to be proactive, you have to kind of wear some paths through the forest of your organization. And you have to kind of lean into what a lot of people in this space tend to have, which is this ability to kind of see around the curve or anticipate something going wrong. How do you encourage people to like recognize that unique thing and sort of give a voice to that sort of instinct, or maybe even develop it if they don't feel like they have it?
Yeah, exactly. Because what we're now talking about is we're combining that technical with the interpersonal and the human piece. It's funny because as you were asking that question, my mind went to this real world example. From 9 months ago, I was working with one organization, or actually I wasn't really performing services for them, but I was actually kind of interacting with them in connection with the project. And this was the first organization I've ever run across that their enterprise risk management function employs a futurist. They actually have a futurist, so someone whose specialization is predicting the future, not reacting, but predicting where things are going in a way, a futurist. Yeah. So I thought that's actually both weird and brilliant at the same time in terms of how you structure your department. So I'm not suggesting that compliance departments should have futurists. That might be a hard sell, although it would probably be a good move.
But you could adopt that as part of the identity. And as you describe yourself to others in the organization, describing yourself as a risk futurist kind of helps put in perspective and kind of clear out some of the way for the input or the perspective that like you're inevitably going to be sharing as the business continues to kind of climb the mountain of commerce or, whatever it is, I really love that concept. Consider that stolen, but like, that's really what our job is. It's not to like put something in place and just kind of, drive in the rear view mirror. We should be seeing around the curve and being able to predict based on an expansion to a new market or a lack of controls in a particular area or a recurring theme that's happening to other, other businesses in our industry to help kind of anticipate what the future might hold and avoid those sort of downside scenarios.
Oh, absolutely. And kudos to you. I love that term, the risk futurist, or compliance futurist, because I think that's exactly where we need to position the compliance professionals, and the
Totally.
compliance functions, looking around the corner. What are we doing to look around the corner? And to me, I'll sound like a little bit like a broken record here, but so I won't go on long on it, but I think it goes back to identifying those drivers. What could create this risk for us? What are the drivers, whether it's competition or environment or staff turnover or really, and that's what a futurist is really doing when you get right down to it. The futurist is looking at different drivers. They might be looking at a bigger picture like the economy and geopolitical stuff and all this sort of thing. That's how we typically envision these futurists. But like with that organization I was referring to, this is a futurist who had a narrower focus. What's the future as it relates to my organization, what my organization does? So compliance is then taking that even a bit more narrow. It's like, what does the future hold for compliance risk for my organization? Right. And to do that, you have to broaden out and look at other aspects of where the organization is going.
I mean, the most valuable people in any department are those who can predict the future. If it's a sales team, it's the guy who can predict what's going to happen this quarter. And, that kind of comes to fruition. If it's a product person, they're predicting where the market is going. If it's somebody in engineering, they're anticipating changes that are likely coming out from new technologies and where the business is going to be going and what the new demands that the market is going to be placing on our, production facilities. Like we need to get out of this sort of reactionary mode, this driving in the rear view mirror, as I say, and really kind of shift our eyes to the future. And, I was talking about this on a recent episode, but there's a particular skill set that a lot of people in compliance have that goes along with like a high level of conscientiousness, a high level of detail orientation, where you can really think through things and you can usually find holes in people's plans. Sometimes you got that kind of shoot from the hip friend or this person in the sales or marketing department who's got all these big ideas and they kind of figure it out as they go. A lot of folks in this space don't have that. We have a different sort of superpower where we can kind of, again, see around the curve and see how plans, are likely to sort of fail. We have to have the confidence to voice that to the organization because that's what we're hired for, to your point. So when we can start to look at risk, not as these sort of like individual Legos on the floor, but something more like, this thing that circulates throughout all these different organs in the body that is our organization and lean into these natural wirings, these natural gifts that many of us have been born with, we can really start to push that impact forward and kind of elevate out of this, barnacle on the ship feeling that a lot of compliance departments still have, where they're just kind of reacting to things later,
Yeah. I mean, what you're describing in a way, Nick, is curiosity and inquisitiveness. It's just like that salesperson doesn't just magically know what the future holds. The salesperson has gathered that information by talking to their customers, doing external research, looking at where the economy is going and things of that nature, looking at what the competitors are doing. So they're collecting contextual data. Yeah. Via conversations, via research, et cetera, and these aren't just guesses. That salesperson, the really wily salesperson, knows that third quarter next year is going to be our down quarter. So we need to make our money in the first and second quarters because I can see this coming based upon my conversations with customers, based on what I'm understanding our industry is going through. We need to adopt that same mindset. Like I said, a lot of this comes natural, but it starts with getting that confidence to ask questions. Not approaching it from the standpoint, I need to be a master of this initially, but having the confidence to say, how's this going to play out next year? It can be something as simple as that. Can I say, help me understand? And sometimes I love the Columbo approach. I don't know, I'm really dating myself with that, but the old Columbo approach, was playing dumber than you really are. Columbo used to always say, I got one more question. Can you help me with this? And yeah. I love that approach. Not just as a fraud investigator, which I used it many times as a fraud investigator and interviewing people, but as a risk manager. Help me understand more about your part of the strategy. That will get you into these kinds of discussions. You don't have to come to the meeting prepared with these very specific risks and things of that nature to begin understanding the future.
Yeah, and you don't even need a trench coat or a boiled egg in order to pull that Columbo move.
No.
So what are some of the
cigar would always help though? Yeah.
What are some of the ways you see compliance, professionals like inadvertently make this thing of sensing the atmosphere or seeing around the curve? Like, what are some of the ways you've seen them make that harder for themselves in how they communicate about risk?
Yeah, I think it does come back a lot to that idea of confidence in expressing yourself. and having that confidence and forcing it. Sometimes, let's face it, sometimes we'd rather stay in our shell for a while. Sometimes you do have to force it, say, I need to go out and have more conversations, and get out of my office a bit. So I think there is an element. Some people are naturally wired much more socially than others, as we know. And for them, this might be easier. They just have to direct that social drive of, channeling it into asking the right kinds of questions, to the right people. Others are just natural introverts and just are not going to be as naturally inclined to do this. So it becomes a matter of sort of tricking or forcing yourself into taking those first steps, and take the easy baby steps first.
Yeah, you said tricking yourself, and here's a great trick. Introverts are merely extroverts with taste. That's what I heard and I read somewhere. And so if you're introverted, it's just like you just have, a more refined taste in people, because introverts that I know, they act like an extrovert in a small setting with somebody that they're super comfortable with, right? Like who meets their sort of threshold of what a reasonable person to have a conversation with is. So like you have it in you, to your point. You just have to kind of trick yourself on how to engage in those kinds of conversations. Listen, even if you have high taste and you only eat at Michelin restaurants, you can, you can slum it a little in a Burger King once in a while. Okay.
Absolutely.
No offense, Burger King. I'm a big Burger King guy. So I want to talk a little bit about kind of risk appetite. This is a concept that, floats around. We've all heard this a bunch of times. And I want to kind of talk about how we can make this mean something. So, we try to define risk appetite sometimes. We've tried to sort of articulate it. We've tried to sort of measure it. Do we have a high or a low risk appetite? But you've kind of suggested that most organizations sort of get this concept wrong where, so like, what do you think is fundamentally wrong with how risk appetite, quote unquote, is like typically framed in the context of sort of risk management?
Yeah, there's a couple things that go into that. For starters, just a misunderstanding of what the term even means. A lot of people think that risk appetite means that I'm allowing certain risk events to happen, which is more what they call, I won't get into the technical definition, but more along the lines of risk tolerance. Tolerance means, the acceptable level with which this risk event might occur. Risk appetite is really more of an acknowledgement that I can't guarantee this risk won't happen. So think of risk appetite as the level of risk that still enables you to get to sleep at night. Okay. I can't guarantee this won't happen, but I can get to sleep knowing I've done enough of prevention and detection here to be able to get to sleep at night, and then that getting to sleep at night actually leads to a really bad metaphor. And I love bad metaphors. I'm one of those people that ever since the introduction of me to gas appliances in the kitchen, I've just been a nervous wreck. So I'm the type that I have done this on several occasions. I've gone to bed, and then I'm in bed thinking, I don't specifically remember turning that burner off. So what am I going to do about it? I'm going to just go downstairs. So I needed to mitigate that risk further. The residual risk was too high for my appetite because I'm scared of gas explosions and fires and things like that. That's really the risk event, is that, right? What would happen if I left that burner on all night? And as some people have pointed out to me, probably nothing would happen. You would just waste a lot of gas, but you probably wouldn't actually have a major risk. But you can't convince me of that because my appetite for that is so low. But now what would happen if you go to bed and right before you're falling asleep, you think, I don't think I put the salt shaker back with the other spices. It might still be out on my dining room table. Do I need to go downstairs and get the salt shaker and move it? No. But I did for the gas burner. Why don't I for the salt shaker? That's risk appetite. What level of risk are you willing to accept, knowing that I can't prevent all those horrible things that could happen if my salt shaker is left out overnight? But that's because those aren't very horrible things. Right. It's like, I have a messy dining room. That's the worst case scenario. Right. So it's a bad metaphor, a bad analogy, whatever you want to call it. But I think it's good. Yeah. And that's what's happening. But the other thing, and I know that you want to get to this, is appetite at the company level is as far as it oftentimes gets. And risk appetite at the company or enterprise level is always articulated in these kind of it's not much different than the vision statement of the company, but with respect to risk. It's lofty. It's just broad generalizations. It's quite honestly,
we maximize risk in the context of our fiduciary duty or whatever.
Yes.
It says something like, it's like a total platitude. Yeah.
Oh, it is. We shall balance risk in an appropriate level to achieve our strategic objectives in the pursuit.
There you go. That's better. So you kind of talked about this thing of like risk-centric appetite statements. So like, what are those and how do you build ones that a business leader will actually engage with rather than that thing that you just kind of, that silly statement that seems to be very pervasive, but like drives no action. Like any of these statements, whether they're, purpose statements or value statements or risk appetite statements, those should all like influence and drive behaviors in the organization. And when, your value is integrity and everybody has that, and that's mere table stakes and you can't really point to any new behaviors that come from it, well, then there's no point in sort of having that word on the wall or whatever. So how do we flesh that out or kind of reframe these kind of risk appetite statements that are going to drive some better action throughout the organization?
Yeah, it's by going further down layer by layer, typically at least 2 layers, down. The first at the enterprise level, it's extremely lofty. So at a minimum, going down and having discussions at a risk category level, like what's our appetite for fraud? What's our appetite for non-compliance? What's our appetite for IT risks? But even that is still many times too lofty of a level. And this is where that idea of risk-centric statements, or what I just call risk-centric discussions, might come into play. So even within compliance, not all compliance problems are created equal, right? So bribery is going to be viewed differently than cheating on an expense report. So, having those discussions, whether you articulate it in a written statement or not is kind of irrelevant. It might help to jot ideas down. Whether that ends up being some formally adopted statement, though, that's really not the point. It's to have the discussions at the risk level. What's our tolerance for employees cheating on their expense report? What's our appetite? What's our appetite for violating the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act? How would you articulate that? And really, it's not just for purposes of having a nice discussion about risk appetite. Keep in mind where risk appetite really presents itself in managing risk is in the risk scale itself.
Right.
And too many times the risk scale is just this arbitrarily developed thing, oftentimes only with dollar amounts on it, that someone says, oh, well, this is what makes it a 3. I actually did a session one time called, oh, no, it's a 3. Because, we play this game of saying, well, if I keep it below a 3, I don't have to do any further risk mitigation. If it goes over a 3, oh, my gosh, it's like, then I need all this mitigation. Well, what's a 3? The 3 needs to reflect risk appetite. All right. And too many times the risk scale is just developed by people who've never had any exposure or discussions regarding risk appetite. So that's why this is so critical to have these discussions, that you can customize your scale so a 3 for expense reporting fraud is very, very different than a 3 for bribery fraud, for bribery.
Right. Yeah, because sometimes those are just kind of viewed in sort of in isolation in their own sort of silos. Whenever we do those things, I like to say no 3s. 1 through 5, no 3s. You got to kind of pick a side, okay? No fence sitters. No fence sitters around here.
Yeah, I know of a couple of organizations that insisted on using a 4-point scale for that very reason. So you can't be in the middle.
All right. Maybe that's a faster way to get to it. So this thing of like, pricing or sort of scoring, risks that have no real meaning in the business. Like, how do we break that habit? How do we avoid what you're talking about, a 3 in expense report versus a 3 over in bribery being totally different? This is like I didn't invent the 1 through 5 thing, like you didn't either. It kind of exists everywhere, but how do we break out of that into something that's more animating or sort of, I guess, substantive or something?
Yeah, it starts with, the numbering system itself, and having 3s. And if you're going to use a 5-point scale, at least having multiple inputs to it. So you can say, well, one person says 3, one person says 4. So we'll use 3.5 and allow the fractional sorts of conclusions and the end. Maybe
maybe weight them by IQ or something.
Yeah, exactly. But so some sort of weighting. But I think it gets to really two things. One is the one that I mentioned is having the scale reflect risk appetite, and that can mean using different factors in the scale for bribery than you might for expense reporting or any other risk. So in having some custom factors that make something a 3 or a 4 for one risk that might not even show up in the other risk, and incorporating those sort of custom factors into the scale. But the other one that I think, and this kind of comes full circle to sort of where we started it in a way, is making sure that strategic goals are reflected in the scale as well. I know a couple of organizations do a really, really good job of that, of saying, this is not just a compliance risk. How does this compliance risk relate to achieving this particular strategic goal? It could be a revenue sales target, it could be whatever. And relating those back to strategy is another way of really building extremely valuable risk scale. So that 3 now really means something.
Well, and I mean, to that point, I mean, that should be our instinct, candidly. Yeah. Our instinct is everything we're talking about should always tie to those business objectives. We should always be intersecting with business strategy, not only to gain some credibility, but to help ensure that the bets that we're making with our time and our resources are actually going to matter in the organization. You know what I'm saying? We just had a session for the Ethicsverse MBA where we spent, an hour plus talking about this exact concept, how to better connect at your ethics and compliance department's initiatives and goals and things to the strategic objectives of the organization. If that's not our instinct, it's very easy to start making those connections. And in doing that, you usually find some things that maybe don't, should be 3s. Okay. You maybe shouldn't be putting so much effort into because they're not really moving the needle, or that thing is kind of on the tracks. We have to be able to bring fresh eyes to all of this stuff. And I think this conversation has been phenomenal because it's at least I feel like I learned a ton in this discussion. So you're very smart, Jerry. Very great job. But I think it gives us yet another perspective on how we can look at our job and how we interact with the business, because we're a very unique department in an organization. We intersect with so many different things in so many different departments. And I think there's so much opportunity in ethics and compliance to really elevate its impact, to really de-risk the organization, add more of that enterprise value that the people at the top care most about. That's how we really get the endorsement that we need to make things, easier. It kind of turns into that kind of a flywheel.
Yeah, I'll add, test drive your risk scales, by the way. You might think you have it, but then test drive them before you start applying them. We take them to some of the risk owners and say, here's what would make the need for mitigating your risk further necessary over this level. Do we have it bucketed right? Look at these criteria and where we've got the 4 bucketed versus the 3 versus the 2 kind of a thing. Right. That mid-range in particular. Say, does it make sense that if these things exist, we would need to do some further risk mitigation? And that if anything below that, you're comfortable with, you can get to sleep at night.
So as we're wrapping up here, Jerry, if a compliance officer leaves this session today and they take one concrete step with them in terms of repositioning themselves in the business or applying some of the stuff that we talked, about, what would you tell them to do first? Where would you tell them to start?
I would start, if I had to pick one place to start, look at what drives the risk that you're dealing with. Look at those drivers, because that really sets you off on that path of figuring out, is that driver really a risk to somebody else? It starts helping you look around the bend, around the corner, like you said, and it sets you up for establishing those relationships with the people who are involved with the driver of the risk. So I would suggest starting with that. If you're not doing any of this stuff, start with the drivers. For starters, are we identifying drivers? The answer to that is oftentimes no. We're only identifying one potential driver of a risk. So spend some time thinking about what could create this risk or what could create the incentive for the risk, and start there.
Okay, one more. I got one more question. We got another minute left. Where do you see this conversation going? Not this thing, this is going to be over in a couple of minutes here, but where do you see this broader conversation or this concept, right? going in terms of like where our industry is sort of heading toward? Like, are there certain aspects of risk relationship or like risk ownership that you think the compliance community hasn't really fully grappled with or haven't really fully kind of wrapped their head around?
Yeah, well, I think if you talk about where the next direction, I think it's going to be taking these concepts that we're talking about and leveraging technology better to help us with those, instead of just going around with a notepad and talking to people and hoping we can connecting all these dots. It's going to be greater use of technology, whether it's using artificial intelligence, like we are with Easter, using artificial intelligence to go out and help build the context and keep updating the context, internal context, external context, to tell us, hey, this risk is changing. I think that's where this is ultimately going, where, risk events are happening so much faster than they used to, for a variety of reasons that we can't really even explore, that I think we inherently have to figure out ways of us getting that peek around the corner, even if it's just a quick glimpse of it, viewing that more efficiently, because we're not going to just be able to do it by talking to a bunch of people. Now, the talking is going to be important, but we're going to need to leverage technology and data even better in this area.
Man, I had high hopes for this one, man, but you knocked it out of the park. Let's get a massive round of applause for the one and only Jerry Zak. Really learned so much. You gave me a lot of stuff to steal, so everyone is going to hear. Everyone who's here today is going to know where the source of a risk futurist is.
Funny. I do the same thing, by the way. I borrow things from other people all the time.
I call it creatively borrowing. Okay, exactly. Ideas are free. Okay, so you just got to use them. But thank you so much. Definitely follow Jerry on LinkedIn. Check out Jim Massey and Jerry. They're doing some really cool stuff, and I hope you guys can join us next Thursday. We have Karen Moore and the one and only Matt Kelly, and we are talking about hot topics. It's our quarterly session, one of our all-time faves. So definitely join us then. We're no session on Tuesday because I am traveling. But love you all. Call your dads. Buy him something nice that's not socks. Okay. See you next week.
Thanks, everyone.